Alright, section 4.1, question number 2. So we have the inverse sine of negative square root of 3 over 2. And we're trying to find the exact value. And even though we know sine is negative in quadrants 3 and 4, it actually only exists, the inverse function, in quadrant 4. So when we say find the exact value, there's just one answer to give to that. So that would be our quadrant 4 angle because it's negative. And if you remember, just here's my little side note, here's my thinking. The sine of pi thirds is square root of 3 over 2, correct? That's that ratio we should have memorized. So that means that the inverse sine of negative square root of 3 over 2 would be negative pi thirds, because it would be the same reference angle, but in the fourth quadrant. Right? You don't need to say that it's quadrant 4. I'm just like constantly reminding us how we know what that answer is, right? Or rather, we learned that the range would be from negative pi halves to positive pi halves. So that's why we're giving our answer as a negative pi thirds instead of as like 5 pi thirds or whatever it would be if we did a positive angle instead. Just reinforcing that stuff we learned in section 4.1. Okay, we're good on that one?
Yeah.
Yes, Carlos, we're good?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Moving on. 22. So we have the sine of the arc sine of negative, ignore that point, negative 0.42. It's going to bug me. I gotta erase it. Okay, this one's pretty easy when you have the inverse in the middle. A negative ratio is going to give you a negative quadrant 4 angle, but then because it's both sine and arc sine, it's like they just cancel each other out. So the answer is just what you started with, because it's like you have a machine, right? That you have the arc sine of negative 0.42, right? And you get out an answer, and you put that answer into the sine of whatever that answer is. And because one is the inverse of the other one, we end up back with what we started, right? That's the premise behind inverses, is that one undoes the other one. And because it's starting with the inverse in the middle, we don't have to worry about the quadrant or anything. It'll just spit out the exact same answer. So do you want us to find that intermediate answer in the middle? Because we don't even need to find it to know that that answer is true.
So, anything would apply probably 21 to just cancel each other out.
Yep, that one will also work that way. You have to be more careful of it when the actual function is in the middle and the inverse is on the outside, because then it's more restricted as to where your answer will be. But when the inverse is in the middle and the original trig function's on the outside, then it should just cancel itself out. So yeah, questions 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27. Yep, you are correct. Oh, and 28. Yeah, including 28. Agreed. Yes. Okay, but then they start to switch where you have the answer, like you have the function in the middle and the inverse on the outside. So then you have to be careful, because in 29 it's a quadrant 1 angle, so that will still work. That'll still just be a quadrant 1 angle answer. And 30 will actually work as well, because that's a quadrant 4, negative quadrant 4 angle, so that one will also come out to be the same exact answer. But when we get to 31, that's where we have to start being careful, because 31 gives us a quadrant 2 angle, which will come out with a quadrant 1 answer because we're doing the inverse of it. And the inverse is only in quadrant 1 and 4. So 31 is where that little cancel the two function and inverse function thing out stops working properly because of the order that our functions are in and because of the quadrants. Okay, looking at 32, I kind of maybe just answered your question. But let's look at it and then we can reinforce what I was just talking about. So a sine of 11 pi over 6. So the sine of 11 pi over 6, all students take calculus. That would be a negative angle, quadrant 4, right? So, I mean, that would be a negative ratio. It's also going to be a negative angle, but we're not to that point yet. So the ratio will be negative 1/2 because the sine of 11 pi over 6 would be negative 1/2 because it's negative in quadrant 4. Well, then the inverse sine of negative 1/2 has to be in this range, just like we talked about on question 2. So it has to be negative pi 6. So even though 11 pi over 6 is a quadrant 4 angle, it's in the right quadrant to give us the correct answer, but it's not in the correct range to give us the correct answer because it has to be that negative angle in the 4th quadrant to be in the range of the inverse. So that's the tricky stuff to understand, is 31 and beyond. Does that make sense? So, like in 31, it gives us a quadrant 2 angle, but the answer is going to be a quadrant 1 angle. 32 gives us a quadrant 4 angle, but it has to be a negative quadrant 4 angle. 33 gives us a quadrant 3 angle, but it has to be a negative quadrant 4 angle, because it's negative both places. Number 34 gives us a... Oh, that one's going to work out nicely, because that's just a quadrant 1 angle. So 34 is easy. 35 is a quadrant 2 angle, so that one works out to a quadrant 2 angle because that's where cosine and inverse cosine, that's where inverse cosine, arc cosine exists, right? But then 36 would be, I don't think that would stay the same. That one's weird. 36, why am I blanking out? So 3 pi halves, that's 270 degrees. So the cosine of 3 pi halves would be the xi, which would be 0. And the inverse cosine of 0 is going to be pi halves, right? So that would change it from 270. Plug in 270, get out 90 because of the range of answers we can get out for cosine. We getting a feel for these? Do you need anything else beyond those? 35, you want to look at 35?
Yeah.
So 35 is one of the easy ones. Because it's a quadrant 2 angle, and arc cosine is in quadrant 2. So the cosine of a quadrant 2 angle is going to be a negative ratio, and then that negative ratio is going to give us a quadrant 2 angle back again, because that's where cosine is defined. So the answer is actually going to be the same. Those are just basically canceling out, and that's because the range of, I can spell because correctly, because for the range, cosine inverse is 0 to pi. So quadrants 1 and 2. Remember that? So sine is quadrants 4 and 1. Negative angles in quadrant 4, positive angles in quadrant 1. But cosine is quadrants 1 and 2. So positive angles in quadrant 1 for positive ratios and positive angles in quadrant 2 for negative ratios. That's the confusing thing, is that sine and cosine spit, inverse sine and inverse cosine spit out different answers. Right? Just have to practice it. get your brain around it.